The city bustled with life as Ms. Wilma stepped out of her modest apartment, her worn silver-gray dress fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. She entered the bustling bank to withdraw funds for a cherished charitable cause. Unnoticed in the crowd, she confidently approached the counter, handing her ATM card to the young clerk, ready to fulfill her meaningful mission. "I'd like to withdraw some money, please," Wilma said, her voice soft but firm. The clerk, barely glancing at her, swiped the card and asked for her ID. Wilma froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her handbag. She rummaged through it, the plastic rustling with urgency, but her ID wasn't there. Panic set in as she checked her pockets, then her bag again, and even the folds of her dress, but it was nowhere to be found. "I'm sorry, I must have left it at home," she stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. The clerk sighed audibly, setting down the card. "Ma'am, you need your ID to withdraw large amounts. It's bank policy. Can't you make an exception?" "I've been banking here for years," Wilma pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. The clerk's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules. Without ID, we can't proceed." Wilma glanced around, her chest tightening as the weight of judgmental stares bore down on her. A middle-aged man whispered to his companion, his voice loud enough for Wilma to hear. "She doesn't look like someone who has a lot of money." "Probably a mistake." A young woman in line snickered. "Why bother coming to the bank if you can't even bring the right documents?" The word stung more than Wilma cared to admit. She felt small, like an intruder in a space that no longer seemed welcoming. She tried to explain herself again, but the clerk's impatience was clear. "Please come back when you have the necessary paperwork," the clerk said dismissively, avoiding Wilma's gaze. Humiliated, Wilma nodded weakly and stepped away from the counter. Her head swam with emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loneliness. Clutching her ATM card tightly, she shuffled to the side, unsure of what to do next. She had no ID, her phone was out of battery, and the kindness of others seemed like a distant dream. The bustling bank suddenly felt unbearably cold and unwelcoming. Wilma stood near the side of the lobby, her mind racing but her body frozen. She clutched her handbag tightly, as if holding onto it might somehow make everything better. Around her, the hustle and bustle of the bank continued, but to her, it felt as though the world had paused, leaving her trapped in a moment of embarrassment and despair. Her hands trembled as she opened her bag again, futilely searching for the ID she already knew wasn't there. She rifled through the worn contents, an old wallet, some receipts, a pair of reading glasses. The lack of her ID felt like a reflection of how she was being seen by others. Incomplete, inadequate, invisible. Murmurs rippled through the bank. Customers waiting in line cast occasional glances at her, their eyes filled with judgment. A middle-aged man whispered to the woman beside him, his voice low but sharp enough for Wilma to catch snippets. "She probably doesn't even have the money she's trying to withdraw," he said. The woman nodded, her tone skeptical. "Exactly. Who comes to the bank for a big withdrawal without an ID? Something's not adding up." Wilma's heart sank deeper with every word she overheard. She wasn't someone who frequently withdrew large sums of money, but this was different. This was for the charity project she had poured her heart into. She thought about the people she wanted to help: homeless families, struggling single parents, and elderly folks like herself who had no one to turn to. She had been so preoccupied with the cause that she hadn't double-checked her bag before leaving home. The whispers grew louder in her mind, even as the bank remained a symphony of muted conversations, clicking keyboards, and ringing phones. To Wilma, the sound of judgment drowned out everything else. One of the bank clerks, seated a few desks away, leaned toward her colleague, her voice tinged with annoyance. "These elderly customers, honestly, they come in here all confused and expect us to solve their problems. It's not our fault she forgot her ID." The other clerk chuckled, shaking her head. "Yeah, and then they get all flustered like it's the end of the world. Look, she's just standing there now. Doesn't even know what to do with herself." Wilma's ears burned as she pretended not to hear. She turned slightly, hoping to find a place to sit, but the nearest bench was occupied by a younger couple engrossed in their phones. She felt the weight of eyes following her as she took a few tentative steps. Her old sandals slapped softly against the polished floor, the sound barely noticeable but, to her, unbearably loud. Nearby, a woman in her 30s glanced at Wilma and turned to the man beside her. "It's kind of sad, really. She doesn't even look like someone who'd have much money. What could she possibly need a large withdrawal for?" The man shrugged. "Could be a scam. You never know these days." The comment stung like a slap. Wilma's cheeks flushed with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She wasn't a fraud. She wasn't confused. She had a purpose, one that should have mattered more than her appearance or her perceived status. But to these strangers, she was just another old woman who didn't belong in a place like this. She took a deep breath and tried to collect herself. "I need to call Angela," she thought, referring to her daughter. Angela would understand, as she always did, and come to her rescue. Wilma reached into her bag for her phone, only to discover that it had gone completely dead. The screen was black, unresponsive, no matter how many times she pressed the power button. Her frustration mounted. Of course, the one time she needed her phone most, it had failed her. She looked around the room, hoping to spot someone who might lend her a phone. Her eyes landed on a well-dressed woman standing near the counter. Wilma hesitated for a moment, then approached her with quiet determination. "Excuse me, ma'am," Wilma began softly, her voice trembling. "Could I borrow your phone for just a moment? I need to call my daughter." The woman barely looked up from her own phone before shaking her head. "Sorry, I'm busy," she replied curtly, not sparing Wilma another glance. Deflated, Wilma stepped back. She tried again with another customer, a man in his 40s wearing a suit. He looked at her with a mix of impatience and suspicion. "I'm afraid I can't help you," he said, brushing past her. Every rejection felt like another layer of isolation. Wilma was no stranger to being overlooked. Life as a black woman in her generation had been full of challenges. But there was something about this moment, this public scrutiny, this sense of being seen and dismissed all at once, that cut deeper than usual. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being judged, reduced to someone unworthy of trust or respect. She found herself back in the same spot she'd started, standing near the edge of the lobby, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. Her chest tightened as she fought back tears. No one cared why she was there or what she needed. To them, she was just a nuisance, an interruption in their busy lives. Wilma's thoughts turned inward, a swirl of self-doubt and frustration. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to handle things on her own. But now, for the first time in years, she felt utterly helpless. How had she let herself get into this situation? She glanced toward the entrance, almost willing Angela to walk through the door. But for now, Wilma stood alone, surrounded by a crowd of strangers who saw only what they wanted to see. Wilma stood near the lobby wall, her body stiff with frustration and humiliation. The bustling sounds of the bank seemed to blur into a single, overwhelming hum. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, clutching her handbag as if it were her only anchor. In her mind, she replayed the clerk's dismissive words, the whispers from the onlookers, and the cold rejections when she had asked to borrow a phone. Just as she was resigning herself to waiting aimlessly, the bank doors swung open, letting in a rush of cool air and a young man. Dressed simply in a crisp white shirt and worn jeans, he carried himself with a relaxed confidence that contrasted with the hurried, self-centered energy of the bank. His dark, neatly cropped hair framed a face of quiet determination, and his sharp brown eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene. His gaze landed on Wilma, lingering for a moment. Her small frame and the defeated slump of her shoulders caught his attention. Something about the way she held herself, both hesitant and resilient, stirred a sense of concern in him. While everyone else seemed too preoccupied to notice her discomfort, he couldn't look away. Wilma, unaware of his attention, stared blankly at the ground. She felt trapped, not only by the physical space but by the judgment in the air, so heavy it felt suffocating. Her mind raced with thoughts of how she might fix the situation, but the only solution she could think of, calling Angela, seemed out of reach with her dead phone and the indifference of those around her. The young man, Marcus, hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. He approached Wilma with a warm but cautious smile, trying not to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, his voice soft but steady. "You seem upset. Is everything all right?" Wilma looked up, surprised by his question. It had been hours, or at least it felt like hours, since anyone had spoken to her with genuine concern. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But something in his tone and his eyes calmed her, melting the wall of frustration she had built around herself. I forgot my ID," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to withdraw some money, but the clerk won't let me without it. And now, my phone's dead, so I can't even call my daughter for help." Marcus nodded, his expression empathetic. He didn't interrupt or rush her, letting her explain at her own pace. When she finished, he offered a reassuring smile. "That sounds frustrating, but it's okay. Let's figure this out. I have a phone. Why don't you use mine to call your daughter?" Wilma blinked, taken aback by his kindness. "You'd do that for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Marcus said without hesitation. "We all need help sometimes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it and handing it to her. Wilma hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she took it. It had been so long since someone had gone out of their way to assist her. She dialed Angela's number, her fingers fumbling slightly on the unfamiliar device. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Wilma's heart sank as the call went to voicemail. She handed the phone back to Marcus, her shoulders slumping again. "She's not answering," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Marcus frowned thoughtfully but remained calm. "That's okay. Let's try again in a minute. Sometimes people miss calls. They're probably busy." Wilma nodded reluctantly, feeling a flicker of hope. Marcus leaned casually against the wall beside her, as though he had all the time in the world to help her solve this problem. His calm demeanor was infectious, and she found herself standing a little straighter, her mind a little clearer. "What's your daughter's name?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. "Angela," Wilma replied. She's always been the one I could count on. I just wish I hadn't forgotten my ID. This whole mess wouldn't have happened." Marcus shook his head. "Don't be too hard on yourself. It happens to everyone. And it's not your fault people here are so quick to judge." Wilma sighed. "It feels like they see me as less, just because I'm old, or maybe because I don't look like someone who'd have money. But they don't know anything about me." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "That's their mistake. And honestly, it says more about them than it does about you." For the first time that day, Wilma felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. Marcus's words, though simple, carried a weight that reassured her. He wasn't just helping her out of obligation. He truly cared. After a moment, Marcus glanced at his phone. "Let's try calling her again. Maybe she'll pick up this time." Wilma nodded, and Marcus redialed Angela's number. This time, after a few rings, a voice came through. "Hello?" Angela's voice was sharp, tinged with concern. Marcus spoke quickly but clearly. "Hi, is this Angela? My name is Marcus. I'm with your mother at the bank. She's okay, but she forgot her ID and her phone's dead. She needs some help with a withdrawal." There was a brief pause before Angela responded, her tone softening. "Oh my God. Thank you for letting me know. I'll be there as soon as I can." Marcus hung up and turned to Wilma with a reassuring smile. "She's on her way." Relief washed over Wilma like a wave. Her knees felt weak, but her heart felt a little lighter. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I don't know how to repay you." Marcus shook his head, his smile warm. "You don't need to repay me, ma'am. It's just the right thing to do." For the first time all day, Wilma felt truly seen. Not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as a person who mattered. And that made all the difference. Wilma stood near the wall, her emotions oscillating between relief and lingering embarrassment. Though Marcus's kindness had been a beacon of hope, the memory of the judgmental stares and whispers still clung to her like a shadow. She found herself glancing toward the bank entrance every few seconds, longing for Angela's arrival to restore her sense of security. Marcus stayed by her side, his presence calm and reassuring. He leaned casually against the wall, His arms crossed, but his posture relaxed. He had no reason to stay, no obligation to help beyond what he had already done, yet he remained. Every now and then, he would smile at Wilma, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, the bank doors swung open and Angela entered. She moved with purpose, her tall, commanding presence instantly drawing attention. Dressed in a sleek black pantsuit and carrying a designer handbag, she exuded confidence and authority. Her dark skin gleamed under the bank's fluorescent lights, and her sharp brown eyes scanned the room until they locked onto her mother. "Mom," Angela called out, her voice warm but laced with concern. Wilma's heart swelled at the sight of her daughter. She raised a hand in a small wave, her lips forming a relieved smile. Angela crossed the room in a few quick strides, her heels clicking decisively against the polished floor. She reached Wilma and immediately placed a protective hand on her mother's shoulder. "Are you all right, Mom?" "I came as fast as I could," Angela said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "I'm okay now," Wilma replied, her voice steadying for the first time in what felt like hours. "Thanks to this young man." She gestured to Marcus, who stood nearby, watching the reunion with a polite smile. Angela turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "Thank you for helping my mother," she said sincerely, extending her hand. "I'm Angela." "Marcus," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "It's no problem. I just wanted to make sure she was okay." Angela nodded, her eyes briefly studying him. There was something about his demeanor, humble yet confident, that struck her. But she turned her focus back to Wilma, her priority clear. "What happened?" she asked. Wilma sighed. "I forgot my ID at home. They wouldn't let me withdraw the money, and my phone was dead. I couldn't call you. People were less than kind." Her voice wavered as she recounted the events, her hand instinctively clutching Angela's arm. Angela's face darkened, her jaw tightening. She glanced around the room, noticing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Though the whispers had quieted since her arrival, she could still feel the weight of unspoken judgment in the air. Her sharp gaze landed on the clerk who had dismissed Wilma earlier, and Angela straightened her posture, exuding even more authority. "Let's fix this," Angela said firmly. She gently guided Wilma toward the counter, Marcus trailing a few steps behind, unwilling to leave just yet. At the counter, the young clerk who had dismissed Wilma earlier visibly stiffened. Her eyes darted nervously between Angela and Wilma, clearly aware that this situation had escalated. Angela placed her handbag on the counter with deliberate precision, leaning forward slightly to address the clerk. "My mother came here earlier to withdraw money," Angela began, her voice measured but firm. "She forgot her ID, yes, but she has been a long-time customer of this bank. I understand policies exist for a reason, but your tone and treatment of her were unacceptable." The clerk's face flushed, her composure faltering. I didn't mean any disrespect," she stammered. "It's just that." Angela raised a hand, cutting her off. "What's done is done. Now, I'd like to speak to the manager." "Please." The clerk hesitated for a moment before scurrying off to find her supervisor. Angela turned to Wilma, her expression softening. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll get this sorted out." Within moments, the manager, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, appeared. He introduced himself as Mr. Parker and approached with a professional but cautious demeanor. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand there's been a misunderstanding." Angela nodded curtly. "Yes. My mother came here to withdraw a significant amount of money for a charitable cause. She forgot her ID, but instead of receiving understanding or assistance, she was treated poorly by your staff. I'd like to resolve this now." Mr. Parker's eyes widened slightly. "A charitable cause, you say?" Wilma, emboldened by her daughter's support, spoke up. "Yes. The money is for a housing project I've been funding for homeless families. It's important, and I didn't mean to cause trouble. I wasn't prepared." Marcus, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. "If I may, sir, I witnessed how she was treated earlier. It wasn't just about the policy. It was about how she was dismissed and judged. I think it's important your staff understands the difference." Mr. Parker's face flushed with embarrassment. I see. I sincerely apologize for the treatment you received. Ms. Wilma, we'll process the transaction immediately. Please allow me to personally oversee it. The transaction was completed swiftly, with Mr. Parker ensuring every step went smoothly. The other bank employees avoided meeting Angela's or Wilma's gaze, the weight of their earlier behavior evident in their posture. As they finished, Angela turned to Marcus, her expression warm. Thank you again, Marcus. You didn't have to stay, but you did. That means a lot. Marcus shrugged modestly. I just did what anyone should. Angela smiled, then handed him her business card. If you ever want to work on something meaningful, give me a call. People like you are rare, and we could use someone like you in my family's foundation. Marcus took the card, surprised but grateful. I'll think about it. Thank you. As Angela and Wilma left the bank, Wilma leaned into her daughter's arm. For the first time that day, she felt lighter, as though the storm had finally passed. Behind them, Marcus stood near the exit, watching them go with a small, contented smile. In that moment, he felt something unexpected, a spark of purpose ignited by a simple act of kindness. As Wilma and Angela exited the bank, Angela glanced at her mother, her expression softening with concern. Mom, why didn't you tell me you had plans to withdraw such a large amount? I could have come with you to make sure everything went smoothly. Wilma sighed, adjusting the strap of her handbag on her shoulder. Angela, I didn't want to bother you. You're always so busy with work, and this is something I've done many times before. I didn't think forgetting my ID would cause such a mess. Angela stopped walking and turned to face her mother. You're never a bother, Mom. I wish you'd stop thinking that. What you're doing is incredible, and you don't have to carry the weight of it all on your own. Wilma gave a small smile. You sound like your father. He used to say the same thing. Angela's features softened further at the mention of her late father. Well, he was right, she said gently. So, tell me, what's this donation for? You didn't give me the details before. They continued walking as Wilma explained. It's for the housing project. Remember the shelter on Elm Street? The one that takes in families who've lost their homes? They've been struggling with funding, so I promised to cover the costs of building a few small units for transitional housing. Angela raised her eyebrows. That's incredible, Mom. How much are you donating? Wilma hesitated, glancing at her daughter. Enough to get them started. They need a strong foundation to work from. Angela stopped again, turning to her mother with a mix of pride and disbelief. Mom, you've always been so humble about these things, but this is no small gesture. You're making a real difference in people's lives. Wilma's expression grew thoughtful. I've been fortunate, Angela. I don't live extravagantly, and your father left us more than enough to be comfortable. But I've seen too many people who don't have the opportunities we've had. Giving back isn't just something I want to do. It's something I have to do. Angela smiled and gently squeezed her mother's arm. And that's why I'm so proud of you. Back at the bank, Marcus reflected on how poorly Wilma had been treated despite her kindness and dignity. It reminded him of his grandmother's wisdom about combating ignorance with grace. The business card Angela had given him felt significant. An opportunity to make a meaningful impact seemed to have fallen into his hands. Meanwhile, as Angela and Wilma returned home, a customer's video of the bank interaction began spreading online. The clip showcased Angela's advocacy for her mother and highlighted Wilma's dedication to helping others. The video quickly gained attention, drawing praise for Wilma's humility and generosity, and sparking conversations about the importance of respecting elders and avoiding judgment based on appearances. That evening, Angela showed Wilma the positive responses flooding social media. Strangers expressed admiration for Wilma's commitment to giving back. Wilma, however, downplayed the recognition, stating her actions were simply meant to help others. Angela reminded her mother that her story of resilience and kindness was inspiring others. They ended the evening in quiet pride, knowing the challenges of the day had sparked something greater, a renewed sense of purpose and hope for the power of community and compassion. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this heartfelt story of kindness, resilience, and community. May it inspire you to spread compassion in your own lives. Wishing everyone good health, happiness, and the strength to make a positive difference in the world. Together, we can build a brighter, more caring future. Stay blessed.